to our weekly Pisces USA live stream. I'm Brandi, and I'm super excited about today's topic because it's one of the things that's invisible but critical. Water chemistry. So let's be honest, aquascaping gets all the love, but water chemistry is what keeps everything alive. When something goes wrong and you don't know why, it's almost always because something with the water. Shelby, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. Are you excited about talking about chemistry?
Uh, it's one of those topics you don't really want to talk about, but you need to talk it about. And it has to be talked about.
All right. So we got a question to start everybody off. Do you want to ask it?
Yes.
That's because you do
So,
this so often, right? We all do this so regularly.
um, how often do you test your water? Weekly, monthly, or never?
So make sure you put it in the chat how often you're testing water. I unfortunately am closer to never. I try to do a good job at it, but it's one of those things that goes on the back burner for me until something starts to look a little off or smell a little off, and that's whenever I start jumping on it.
Yeah, when I freshly cycle a tank is when I check to make sure that the parameters are correct. And then I know as long as I'm doing my water changes, that normally things are good and I don't need to chase the parameters, is what it's called, and checking it constantly. I would only check it if I see something is wrong with the tank, like die-offs or plants
So
aren't looking too hot.
So I want to have the asterisk there. This is terrible advice if you're a newbie, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
today we're talking about 4 key parameters, and I also want to talk about oxygen because that's one that nobody ever talks about, but it's so important.
Yeah.
And I was telling Shelby this analogy, and I can't remember if I came up with it during a live stream or if someone said it to me. So if someone said it to me, I'm sorry that I'm taking credit. But I see the parameters as being like training wheels, right? When you're first learning how to ride a bike, you're going to use training wheels. That doesn't mean you have to always use training wheels, but the training wheels are to make sure you don't tip too far left or right. Well, once you're good at riding a bike or professional riding a bike, you might be tipping lots of ways and doing flips and doing all kinds of crazy things with your bike that you're not doing when you still have training wheels. The parameters are to make sure when you're new that you know not to tip too far one way or the other or do something extreme or crazy until you get comfortable with what a tank is supposed to be like. All right. Transition question.
Yeah.
Why does chemistry... You going to get it?
No.
I wrote down a bunch of notes for us. I always write down notes for us, and then we never know who's saying what. I'm over prepared. All right.
Yeah.
So, why does chemistry even matter in a fish tank? So, your fish tank is a closed system. Unlike a lake or a river, there's no water coming in or out regularly. You have to physically make that happen. There's no rain. There's no way for waste to leave. It's always staying. It's always adding. Anything that you put in that tank stays in that tank until you take it out. Good chemistry means you're going to have healthy fish, vibrant plants, happy shrimp. Well, I always throw in shrimp because of Shelby. Bad chemistry means you're going to have stress. That's more likely to cause disease. Algae blooms are going to show up. That's going to be unsightly. You're probably not going to enjoy looking at your tank. And it can sometimes even lead to sudden death for all your fish. All right. What's our first one we're talking about?
Let's talk about pH.
All right. So what do we know about pH?
So that pH measures how acidic or alkaline the water is. So the scale usually runs from 0 to 14. Most aquariums, I would say, need to be like a neutral pH. So shooting for 7 is usually good. So 6.5 to 7.5 is usually where you want to stay in the range of. There are different cases where you might have African cichlids, which like it up in the high 8s. And then you have like some shrimp, like the caridina, that like it really low, so way down past below 6.
Yeah, so I would say pH is one of those like base parameters that you got to get that right first, right? Like, because it impacts everything. The fish, like what fish you can keep, whether or not they're healthy or not, bacterial efficiency. We talked about that a little bit last week with the nitrogen cycle, even plant uptake. So pH is actually going to push chemicals to be a certain form or a different form. I could be a lot more technical about that, but that's technical. It can make it one form or another form. And if depending on what form those chemicals are in, is going to impact whether or not cellular processes can use them. What are things that can impact your pH, Shelby?
So sometimes it could be rocks to different substrates and woods. Botanicals tend to lower it a little bit. Mostly substrate, though, to me is the biggest key. Some people like the look of certain substrate and might go out and want like the seashell substrate and then want to put like discus in it, trying to get this whole beachy theme and not realizing that they just made the most crucial mistake of their fish hobby, is putting the high pH and then a low pH fish in it.
Yeah, so like the seashells and stuff, like those types of environments like high pHs. So the things you find in those environments, luckily, push the pH up. But then there's some fish that are not going to survive in that. Is it possible if you... So as you were talking about that, I had a question. You might say, Brandi, that's a dumb question. Okay. If you wanted discus, but you wanted seashells in there, is there anything that you could put in your water to reduce the pH enough that you could keep discus, or is that just not ever going to happen?
No, because they really need it lower. You could put like fake seashells, like that, well, the ones that have been bleached and cleaned. You could put those in the tank, and they wouldn't affect the water chemistry enough. And you could do like a white beachy sand that we have from Pisces that like gives that sand beachy feeling, but doesn't necessarily mess with the water chemistry. So you could make it as if it looked like that and not have it be like the aragonite or crushed coral, things like that. So there is a way to do things, but I find this actually happens so much with more of the aqua soil than anything else, that people don't understand when they get the aqua soil that it lowers your pH so much. So people try to do like planted tanks and then put like a cichlid and things like that. And they also use like tap water for that, which it's supposed to buffer the water. If you put too much of the other minerals we'll talk about later, it will mess up the substrate and ruin all the parameters you're trying to reach in the first place.
So I actually have a test kit right here with me. And this test kit, what all is in this test kit? So this is an API master test kit. And it does pH, ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate, sorry. And it actually has two different pH tests. It has a low pH and a high pH because I guess one's probably for above. I don't know what the pH is actually on it. Do you know what the pH for that is?
Yeah, so it's usually to test above 7.
Yeah, so below 7 and above 7, right?
Yeah.
So for my saltwater tank, I never use the regular one. I only ever use the high range because it better never be below 8. Otherwise, I've got a problem. But for my freshwater tanks, I only use the normal test one because that better never be much above 7, right?
Yeah.
So we have the next one after pH. Which one is that?
Yes. That one is GH, general hardness. It measures calcium and magnesium. These are minerals that are essential for shrimp's molting, snail shells, and bone strength, um, for the shrimp and different invertebrates.
So this is one that I'm not actually super familiar with because it's not something that we're measuring a lot in reef tanks. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think, is there anything that you add to a freshwater tank to keep hardness at a certain level, or is there any levels you want to keep it at?
Yeah, so this GH specifically is what you would use for our Caridina shrimp. And there is GH only minerals so that you can mix it to the right mineral content for the Caridina species. You don't want KH with these. So you have to have this, and that's when we bring in a TDS meter and measure into a specific TDS dissolved solids for this mineral to redo these tanks.
So is there like a level that you're shooting for? Like for pH is like
Yeah.
6.5 to 7.5. Do you know that number off the top of your head?
So with the GH, we don't normally, I don't test it for specific GH. I only test the TDS because I know that it will be at the right GH level with the TDS. So we only test for around 130 to 150 TDS, and then we know it's correct. You could also do it on the test kits, but they're a little bit more difficult than just normal test kits. I honestly hate testing for GH and KH. It's like the worst thing because you add one drop at a time and
It's a
then you twist
titration,
it
yeah.
and then you keep doing, and it just drives me crazy because like if it's off the roof, you're doing that for like a good time trying
Yeah.
to figure out how high it is.
So let's talk about TDS first then. What is TDS?
Total dissolved solids. So it's testing for like minerals, salts, waste, fertilizers, and things that could be dissolved in the water. It's measured in parts per million. Um,
So in our reef tanks, we use TDS as we're
mhm.
making our salt water. So we have to have this big RODI system to make sure we have zero TDS. So that means we have nothing in it whatsoever. It's just pure water. So that's where we want to start, and then we add salt water to that.
Yeah.
But it's not the same for freshwater, right? In fact, I was
No, it
told
is.
not to use my RODI for my freshwater.
So we use the RO system for our freshwater for Caridina, because you can't have KH in the system. Now, most typical freshwater tanks can have KH in the tank. It's not a problem. It's only when you really have these special Caridina that we do the RO and um mix it with the minerals. So we use the TDS meter for that and then mix it all together. And that's why we read it. Sometimes you could use a TDS measure in freshwater if something's going wrong in the tank. We've done it to test from like our water parameters to someone else's water parameters when we're going to shows for different tanks. Like ours, generally out of the tap, is only 170. But I go to Tampa, which is only 45 minutes away, and it's up to 800. And it's crazy, like the difference in just to total dissolved solids. There is other reasons
So
people
in my
do this.
mind, 800 is really dirty water. Like that's
It's
from my
liquid
reef
rock.
keeping side. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
like
it's
like if you have 800 TDS, you are burning through filters on your RODI because it is
right.
just it is a lot that is having to be pulled out.
Yeah, that's people struggle in Tampa. I think that's why it's kind of like a cichlid heaven for people. Like they do really well with cichlids in Tampa. Like it's got a lot of minerals in that water. It's basically limestone at this point, liquid limestone. So
Yeah, I know for reef tanks, we actually add essentially liquid limestone into our tank. We call it kalkwasser, uh, calc for the KH,
mhm.
KALK. But yeah, like we're literally adding liquid limestone to our tank. So the TDS, for freshwater, it's not really good or bad. It's just a tool for understanding trends, right?
Yeah.
When would you make decisions? Like, what if you saw a certain number, does that indicate like you need to do a water change or you need to add more minerals? Like, how do you use that number from your pen to, you have a pen, right? You showed it already?
Yes. Yeah. I
Yes.
don't think I showed it on stream. So this is our TDS. We usually just buy these off of Amazon. They're really cheap. There are fancier ones you could do that have like pH, TDS, all these.
I have a
fancy
pH
things.
one.
Nice. Those are fancy too. These only cost like $12. So it's usually just cheaper to keep buying them than it is to like get batteries and worry about calibrating a fancy one, because the calibration fluid quite a bit. But these work great. And then if we don't have, like, we mix our minerals overnight, so we'll measure it, make sure it's good. We might have to add more. The only other time, sometimes, if we've tested tanks that we just were curious on what the TDS was, we haven't done a water change in quite some time, what did it raise to, or if there's something wrong. We don't typically do it as much, but as a newbie, it could be very useful to stick it in and see if there is something going on. Check the total dissolved solids. It could be out the roof, and then that could be a really good indicator that you do need to do a water change.
I might get a TDS meter because I'm just curious what some of my freshwater tanks would measure. I'm like, with how bad I have one that's in line for my RODI, but I don't have an actual pen. I'm curious if my poor husbandry techniques actually impacts my TDS and in what direction.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked a little bit about TDS. We talked about the GH and how, like, all these things are really connected. So it's hard to talk about one without talking about the other. We also talked a little bit about KH already. So KH is your carbonate hardness. So whenever I was doing freshwater many years ago, I never worried about testing KH because I knew if my pH was a certain level, my KH was a similar level. So they tend to be connected. But in systems where you're actively adding minerals or something to the water, these can get out of balance. In a reef tank, it's very easy for your pH to be high, even if your KH is low. Freshwater tank, I don't think that happens as often, right? Am I wrong about that? Or
no, it's the KH is completely different in freshwater. It's strange because, like, when you think about it in the water chemistry and how if your KH is too low, your pH can crash. But like with our Caridina tanks, that takes it like right out the window because like ours is a very low pH and 0 KH. And that's what I was talking about earlier about the substrate. If you were to use the substrate, which it could be from Brightwell to Fluval, all buffering substrates, if you were to add in KH, it starts to break down the substrate faster. So a lot of people get these thinking they're great for planted tanks, and then they use tap water, which has usually a lot of KH in it from most places. It's very rare that someone has like 0 KH in their water. It breaks it down so fast, and people are like, oh, my fluval substrate's turning to mud in less than a year. And it's like, well, because you're not supposed to be using it that way. These are usually for nicer planted tanks. And
that's because KH, the substrates that raise KH, they're actually putting ion in the water that's super reactive. So that ion is going to actually, like, imagine a volcano, right? If you put baking soda and vinegar together, they're going to bubble up and it's going to use up all your vinegar and baking soda. But if you don't ever put them together, it's not going to get used up. Well, the chemicals that raise KH or that contribute to KH are highly reactive, and they're going to actually interact with different things. KH can be, for a reef tank, KH is a way to indicate how much carbonate you have in your water for your coral to take up. So a coral is actually pulling the KH out actively. I put in like 3 gallons of alkalinity, KH, into my reef tank every day because my corals are pulling out about 3 gallons of KH every day.
Wow.
I know, right?
I
So-
could just hook up the runoff from the RO system. Would that work? I feel like that's taking all of the minerals you need for the corals out.
Oh, the problem is there's so many minerals in that runoff that will kill the coral. So
Oh no.
I know, right?
Just
So
can't win, can we?
can't win. Uh, so it's one of those things that, like, when everything's stable, like KH can stabilize your pH. If you have a drop in KH, your pH can go real acid very quick. As long as you have some KH in the water, the chances of that acidity dropping is pretty slim. But when everything's in line, like all these chemicals work with each other to kind of stay in the baseline of where you want it to be. I'm always so amazed by nature that these chemicals just want to stay in the range that we need them to for life. And so we have, what have we talked about? pH, GH, which is one of the ones I'm not super familiar with because we don't use it at all in fresh or in salt water. KH and TDS. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that freshwater people look at?
This isn't something most people think about, but it is the dissolved oxygen. That's the invisible killer we were kind of talking about in the beginning. Now, this is something that is probably like the biggest debate in freshwater. So I'm kind of curious on how it is with saltwater because we talk about this all the time in freshwater, and there's people that swear that they don't need oxygen for their tanks, that they do better, that it's natural, and like that. I swear this is the most controversial thing in freshwater.
Really?
Yeah.
So I added this to our script because we talked about it last week with the nitrate cycle or the nitrogen cycle. So a lot of times bacterial blooms can just suck all of the oxygen straight out of the tank. So if you have fish in your tank that need oxygen to breathe and you have no oxygen, that's a problem. So explain why it's a debate for freshwater.
There's just a lot of people that there's a lot of people that do like the filterless setups, and they'll do plants, so it provides some oxygen, but they won't do filters where there's running water. Like I believe in like reef communities. Could you imagine someone saying like you would never need a filter for your reef tank? Yeah. So like they do that for freshwater, which I understand. Some people do have success with them.
Steven said people swear a lot of wrong things.
So it's like I just feel like the plants, everything does better with more oxygen in the tank. But people like they have the bowls that you just kind of sit on the counter and you do planted bowls, which are beautiful, and for like things like shrimp or snails that don't necessarily need that much oxygen, I think they're fine for. When you get into like certain fish, especially higher end, more expensive, bigger, like a cichlid, I would never see in a filterless setup because I believe that they need more oxygen than something so little like shrimp. So that is one of those things that you don't need filtration for your tank. You don't need an oxygen. You don't need any of this. And then sometimes preach that you don't even need water changes. And I'm like, well, the water changes would help with the oxygen level. So it's just all over the place in freshwater to people very strongly opinionated on that, on not having filters, to people that are like on the other end that like the more filtration, the better. I think in the middle is pretty good for any beginner, is just having some sort of aeration, filtration for the system. I do believe that sometimes fish do struggle a lot without that filtration and that oxygen in the water. And I've seen it firsthand when I've had tank's running for quite some time, and then all of a sudden my filter stops working, and that fish doesn't look so good. And I'm like, well, the water parameters are good, so what's causing the issue now? So it's got to be oxygen. That usually is what is deducted down. And so
oxygen is a crutch. So it basically comes down to cellular respiration, right? So cellular respiration is a combustion reaction, which is like, you can think about fire. If you can smother a fire so it doesn't have any oxygen, the fire goes away. Same thing happens for cells. All cells have to do combustion reactions. That's what cellular respiration is. We're going back to biology class in 9th grade. So if you're not providing,
don't pay attention to.
if you're not, y'all can all tap out, take a short nap. But if you're not providing oxygen in some capacity for the cells in the tank, they will die. Every cell goes through cellular respiration, even plant cells. Hey, Cheryl. Even plant cells do cellular respiration. The thing about plants is they can provide their own oxygen to have cellular respiration. So the idea of someone having a tank completely devoid of oxygen baffles my mind. Now, there are organisms that can probably thrive in a lower oxygen environment because their cellular respiration rate is probably a lot lower. But like what you were saying, like the big fish, those have a higher cellular respiration rate, so they're going to need more oxygen. Just like when you run really fast, your cellular respiration requirements go up because you're using more muscles. The more muscles you use, the more oxygen, the more combustion reactions you need. And what happens if you run very fast?
Right.
Like we start gasping for air, right?
Yeah.
And like you can see fish doing that. Like I've seen, like at Global 2 years ago, actually, I walked by someone's tank and all their fish were gasping for air or gasping for the water. And obviously the oxygen levels had gotten low. All they did was point the filter at the top of the water, and within 10 minutes the fish started calming down. So I find it very interesting.
I've seen the opposite too. The CO2 dumping out into the water column has also caused them to freak out, float at the top, or instantly die. Too much oxygen can also be a problem. So that was, I've seen that at Global, which was not fun. It's CO2 can dump right into a tank, and it's an unpleasant sight.
Yeah, so all these chemistry things, like the more, again, this is the training wheels analogy, right? The more you've experienced the effects of chemical problems, the more likely you're going to be able to recognize what's going on immediately. And you don't need to test the tank to say, oh, this is the problem, let's fix it this way. Versus being brand new and not knowing where to even start. So if you are having issues with low oxygen, like just as simple as breaking the surface area so that you can have gas transfer in the water can help. What happens if you get too much carbon dioxide? What do you do for that?
Water change. That's the only thing I could think of right away to help, but not too dramatic. But that would be the first step at least. And one thing I want to point out, because as a beginner, I definitely didn't even think about this either, about how warm water holds less oxygen too. So a lot of people, especially in Florida, your tanks kind of seem to warm up a little bit. I just didn't even think about something like that.
Yeah, so that was in our notes. I wasn't even looking at our notes anymore. If you have a sudden issue with your fish gasping for water or air, whatever it is, like it might be that they're not getting enough oxygen because the water's gotten too warm. I have in the notes also that heavy plant loads can have nighttime crashes. And that's because what I was saying, the plants need oxygen too. So at night they stop photosynthesizing, they stop putting oxygen into the water but they're still taking it up because they're growing. And all living cells need oxygen. And so they can take up so much oxygen and they're not replenishing it now that you can have nighttime crashes. CO2 injection without surface agitation. And that's because, like you're putting in the CO2, there's only so much gas that the water can hold before it starts off gassing. And it's going to start off gassing oxygen first, I believe. And then overstocking low flow areas where oxygen isn't getting mixed up in the water.
Stephen P had a good point. Make sure to turn off the CO2 might be the very first step. You know? Yeah, that might be for sure.
Don't take a straw and blow bubbles in the water, right? We can tell you what not to do. Yeah. Don't make it worse. Yeah, turn off the CO2. That might be a good thing. Hey, Fish Fam. The nitrogen cycle I'll have in our notes, but I think we covered that pretty well last week.
Yep.
I think basically as long as you keep those numbers stable, the pH stable, your KH, the TDS right where it needs to be, your nitrogen cycle, those beneficial bacteria are going to be super happy, and they're going to be thriving, and they're going to be making sure that your fish are in the best environment possible. I have testing tips. Do we want to talk about testing tips real quick? From people who do not follow best protocols. What tips do you have for people for testing?
I would test it. You definitely need to test it when you're cycling. You need to know, that's a good thing. When you're a beginner, you do need to know nitrogen cycle. And I know people usually skip this step when they're beginners. So hopefully they watch that video that we have already done about cycling your tank. I would test them before you add any livestock. And then in the beginning, I would test weekly as you're doing your water changes. Make sure you're not doing anything wrong, adding the wrong water parameters. Because some people like to watch their tank evaporate because they forget to put a lid on. And then they go add just tap water in and don't realize that they're building up these minerals. So testing weekly could help them prevent issues from coming up, because then they notice, oh, well, why are my parameters off? And then maybe be able to get some information on why things are doing that. So weekly testing would probably help for beginners. And then after that, like you said, start removing the training wheels. And I mean, even doing just a simple TDS meter of your tank once a week might help. If there's like a huge fluctuation where, oh, it's supposed to be around this TDS, because like even like neocaridina in some tanks generally lay around like 300 TDS. You can go a little bit more. I have had them go up to 800, but like say you're getting into like 800, 900,000 range, that's where you would want to start testing. So that's a good way to know. And then they got like the strips that are really easy. They're not as accurate as
Davo mentioned the strips too.
Yeah, they're not as accurate, but they still do they do their job for if there's something really wrong with the tank. Now, if you know, don't have breeding going on, and that's when you're starting to get more serious, that's when you would probably want to do the drop testing, because it is a more accurate read for all of those parameters.
Yeah, I think that's all really good advice. Your husband said clean the tubes with RO water, not tap.
Yeah, this is a big thing that we kind of argued about all the time. And I was like, oh, it cannot affect it that much. I mean, we're talking a drop of water on this. Mind you, our tap water only has 170 TDS dissolved solids. It's around 7 pH. It's very neutral. It's not too much.
I'm assuming he's talking about these tubes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So when I rinse those out in the sink, I could go test my low pH tanks, and he would tell me that they're inaccurate because I use the sink water. And I'm like, well, I rinse it with the tank water. And he was like, yeah, but it's still not working. And so sure enough, I went back. You can use distilled water. I use RO because it breaks down all those minerals that are in it, and rinsed it out. Came back, and sure enough, it was testing completely different. And I was wrong. So you would want to rinse it with distilled water or RO water.
Yeah, so I have this.
Perfect.
This is from years of working in a lab, right? I would never do the tap water. Unfortunately, I have to agree with your husband on this one.
Yeah.
Every time I get done washing one of these, I rinse them in the tank or in the tap to begin with, but then I rinse it with RODI water to get all those minerals and everything out. So that way I start completely fresh. I let it dry afterwards. And it also, you don't end up with water droplets after. Because the water drops are minerals left in the water. So if you have RODI, which has no minerals in it, there's going to be no drops left. So some people rinse their glassware if they're very anal about it in RO water as well. Sorry, dechlorinator-related anoxic conditions have most frequently been reported with wastewater treatment and local waterways, but also document that better than hobbyist aquariums.
That's cool.
I don't exactly know what that means, but I'd have to read that a little bit more. Grant is correct, and I still don't do it. I think if
do it because I was wrong, and it was a big dramatic. Now, if it's like a regular guppy tank, things like that, it probably wouldn't make much of a difference. But if you're trying to hit specific lower numbers, you do not want minerals in that test tube at all, because I'm thinking my substrate is not correct anymore. It's not working because it's testing higher of a pH. Now I go clean it out and come back and test the pH, and all of a sudden it is the correct pH, and now I have nothing to worry about.
we Geek Boy is saying that he's lazy. He's like, rinse, let alone rinse with fancy schmancy water. Part of why I don't test. That is one thing that is frustrating. Like, and it's one of the things I've tried to push out a lot. And we're running way over today. As I was trying to wrap it up, I've tried to push and make people understand. I've worked in a lab for many, many years, which is why I know that these water bottles exist. And the amount of variables that can impact testing more than people realize is mind-boggling. Even these tests that have like a line and say to fill to the line, if you get a pipetter, let me see if I have my pipetter easily accessible. Yep. So if you have I don't have the tip for it. So there's tips that go on the end of these. And it is a ultra precise. I know.
Oh my goodness.
This is what happens when you are. Thank you guys for bearing with me while I'm talking about all my science stuff. So this is an ultra precise way of testing your stuff. So if you put in 5 milliliters, it's going to be 5 milliliters exactly every single time. Well, if you take every single one of these tubes, and I haven't done this with API, but I've done it with some other test tubes. But if you take every single one of these tubes and fill them with exactly 5 milliliters, every single one is going to be at a different spot from these lines. Because most of the time, these lines are not calibrated as closely as we would like. So 5 milliliters might be different from container to container. So if you have 4 different test tubes and you test each one of those test tubes to the line for pH, you might get a different result for every single test tube because each one has a slightly different level of water in it. So even something that minuscule can impact your testing.
That's crazy.
I know.
Didn't even, think about something like that, but I did notice the tubes themselves, the bigger, the different sizes. Yeah, they do test different. And I think that might be why sometimes people say that the strips are a little bit more accurate than the tubes, because maybe not taking care of them the correct way, or that the milliliters are off, where the test strips are not testing any of that or getting different residuals.
Yeah, the test strips take out a lot of the variables. Like even just like dropping these in here, right? Like if you're squeezing the bottle harder or yeah, like, and a lot of times those drops are calibrated so that it's a a certain amount is coming out every single time, but from container to container, that calibration can be off a little bit. So, yeah, there's a lot of variables. So
Yeah.
I totally understand why someone would do strips or not test at all. But when you're first getting started, that little bit of nuance is not going to make that much of a difference. So, yeah, we are at almost 40 minutes, you guys. So I'm going to call it quits. Aquascaping is an art, but only if the science works. And I totally love that you guys let me geek out on science for a little bit. That is my jam. The science is my jam. We will see you guys next week. I think we're going to be talking about some new products next week. Hopefully you guys like our Tuesday time. And anything you want to add, Shelby?
Nope. Just catch us next week.